All right, could we have the slides up, please? And let me say again, welcome to this seminar or webinar, which is best practice considerations and recommendations for sponsors in mitigating financial toxicity for participants in clinical trials. You're on slide 15. Maybe we could go back to slide 1, which is the beginning. Thank you. You're now seeing there we go. So I do want to say at the outset that we have the Q&A open, and please put your questions as you think about them into the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Any questions that come in that we don't have time to answer, we will get to and respond. The slides and webinar and answers to questions we don't have a chance to get to will be posted. The webinar will be on YouTube, and the slides and link will be available on the MRCT and the EACT website following this webinar. Probably takes about 3 or 4 days to put that up, but we will send all the registrants a link when that is available. I also want to say that this is being recorded. So, and the captions at the bottom of your screen, if you want closed captioning, please turn that on. So with that, let me welcome you. And my name is Barbara Beer. I am the faculty director of the MRCT Center. And I'll introduce our panelists in a second. But let me go to the next slide, please, which is the disclaimer. And oh, it's not the disclaimer. It is our panelists. So I'm delighted to introduce Wendy Selig, who is the founder of WS Collaborative and the project lead for the EACT initiative, and has really led an amazing process over the last 2 years or 3 years now to develop the materials that you'll hear about. And Dr. David Gerber is the Associate Director of Clinical Research at UT Southwestern Medical Center and has been an absolute phenomenal lead in helping to organize the materials and tools that are available through the EACT. Could I have the next slide? So this is the disclaimer. Nothing we say here is meant to represent the position of Brigham and Women's Hospital, Mass General Brigham, Harvard, HHS, FDA, any other organization, institution, or entity. We are supported by voluntary contributions from a number of different organizations. Those are all reflected on our website and by grants. We are committed to autonomy in our work and transparency in our relationships and are responsible for what we say and do. And then this is available under a CC license. Please use it with permission and acknowledgement of the MRCT Center. Could I have the next slide, please? So the MRCT Center, the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, is an applied research and policy center which is focused on addressing the conduct, oversight, ethics, and regulatory environment for clinical trials around the world. Everything we do has an international focus and is about clinical trials and clinical research. We think of ourselves as a think and do tank and do the, sort of address emerging issues through a stakeholder engagement. Could I have the next slide, please? That really involves pharma, CROs, patient advocates, academics, investigators, regulatory and personnel, IRBs, and anybody who really would be involved in that issue and have a stake in its outcome in order to try and find and create ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. If not solutions, at least approaches to those problems, with the idea that over time, we want to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of clinical trials globally. So with that, could I have the next slide? We started working on financial toxicity and the challenge of participants in clinical trials, not only the burden of participating in clinical trials, but of bearing the responsibility for the financial commitment that is required for participation in clinical trials. As recently as 2 days ago, there was a report from the American Society of Hematologists, the meeting is going on now, that almost 1 in 3 families facing pediatric ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, face catastrophic financial challenges. And that is defined as losing 25% of your financial, sort of ability over time. Daniel Zhang of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia surveyed 422 participants. 1/3 of those families experienced that hardship. 22% reported housing insecurity, 16% food insecurity, and almost 9% challenges paying for even things like utilities. And what a nurse practitioner said is, what's so sad is that for some of our family, their child's cancer diagnosis is not the hardest thing they're facing. That's the sort of element that we're talking about today, that for the benefit of sometimes direct benefit, but also for generalizable knowledge and for the benefit of society, participants and their families are really experiencing incredible financial hardship, not because of their disease only, but because of their participation in clinical trials. Could I have the next slide, please? And this has a direct relationship on mortality. Another study showed also published this year in October that amongst 42,000 patients, 8.5% developed financial toxicity, which is a credit score below 600 after their diagnosis. An additional 3% were already in that category. And for those patients whose credit fell by more than 2 tiers, there was a 30% higher risk of death. Over any 6-month period after diagnosis, a 1-tier drop increased mortality risk by 12%, a 2-tier drop by 63%, compared with patients who scored remained stable. Now that's a complicated statistic, and probably multidimensional, because those who are sicker obviously may not be able to work and may also face increased financial burden from continued participation in trials and other care. But it does show how significant an impact financial health has on individuals and their families and survival. We started working on payment for participant in clinical trials over 10 years ago. Could I have the next slide, please? And published, the framework at that time, and really thought about payment for research participants as reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses. Nobody should be worse off at the end of a clinical trial than at the beginning. Compensation for time and burdens, incentives for participation. Those are different kinds of payments. And it actually helps IRBs if they're distinguished when they are presented for approval. We did this work, could I have the next slide, based on lots of prior contributions, largely from the NIH, but also others. When we think of reimbursement, there are no tax implications. If you retain, the documentation of the expenses, and it is something that Wendy will address. But that, but compensation has other reportable requirements as well as impacts on financial stability for these families. Could I have the next slide? We did an analysis of federally funded means-tested programs, and every one of the ones listed there is impacted by compensation that is recorded as income. And we dissect each of these here. We're not going to have time today to go into this, but you'll hear about the tax implications. You'll also hear from David Gerber about how sites and others can be prepared to provide this kind of support to participants as a critical part of their participation. So with that, let me turn it over to Wendy. And again, thank you for having us and for being part of this presentation today. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And thank you to the MRCT and also to Dr. Gerber for being here with us today. We are thrilled at the opportunity to share some of the work that it's EACT, but we call it EACT. So you're going to hear us say EACT, Equitable Access to Clinical Trials Initiative. And I will tell you a little bit about that if we could have the next slide. Great. So just a little bit of background about the EACT initiative. As Barbara mentioned, we have been working now in a collaborative sort of coalition of the willing kind of way with a number of groups, which I'll show you in a minute, since 2022. The initial impetus for this work, which is hosted by the LUNGevity Foundation, a nonprofit patient advocacy organization in the lung cancer space, it initially began with looking at lung cancer clinical trials, so focused down on a particular disease area of relevance, and quickly discovered, as Barbara has described, that the issues facing lung cancer patients in clinical trials are virtually the same as those facing any cancer patient, are virtually the same as those facing any person in a clinical trials with a serious disease. And so we felt pretty confident that we could expand our work and sort of make our lens all oncology clinical trials. And so a forum was created to bring the stakeholders together to talk about who's doing what, where are best practices, and are there opportunities for us to partner in collaborative action to improve the landscape for any cancer patient interested in a clinical trial. So the format of this initiative, as I said, it's just people coming together. It's not an official coalition of any kind. LUNGevity provides the opportunity through me to convene the groups, and we have a steering group that has been working with me and my LUNGevity partner to help us think about what topics are of interest. We get together in an all-hands kind of virtual meeting format 3 to 4 times a year. And over the last several years, since 2023, we have broken up into some working groups to create some of the tools that I will tell you about and that David Gerber will tell you about in short order here today. So you can see we've focused on filling gaps, identifying and defining best practices and some consensus standards for the pharmaceutical industry, because it was clear that while many companies are trying to address these financial impacts of trial participation, not everyone was doing it the same way. As Barbara mentioned, and I'll talk more about shortly, we looked at the tax and legal issues, and I should say that is particularly a U.S. circumstance based on U.S. policy and regulation. We focused on efforts to educate healthcare practitioners, and by that I mean broadly, all healthcare providers and practitioners that are at the site level working on clinical trials. And that work led into some deeper dive best practice recommendations, which David will talk about in a little bit, that are particularly aimed at sites. I'll talk about what's available for sponsors. We've been spending a lot of time on dissemination of these resources, including this wonderful event today, for which we're so grateful to the MRCT for offering us this opportunity. And also we've engaged with the IRB community, because we know that our colleagues who work in IRBs are important stakeholders here. So if I could have the next slide, please. So some organizations have come and go over the several years we've been at this, but our current roster of organizations, logos are represented here. You can see we have a number of patient advocacy organizations in the nonprofit space. We have a number of wonderful partners at the site level, including the MRCT. And just as a side note, that when Barbara and Willianne joined us, I would say the caliber of our work and the energy behind our effort went up significantly, and we're really grateful that MRCT is doing all the amazing things that it does and bringing that to the table for EACT. UT Southwestern and Dr. Gerber is here, Yale and Penn. We have all the trade organizations that represent the different practitioners in the oncology space, which is important. We have a number of organizations that are broadly focused on clinical trials and on IRBs. We have some for-profit companies, including those that are sponsors of drug trials. We have a CRO at the table, and we also have three of the companies that work in the concierge space, providing third-party vendor support to help participants offset expenses in trials. So it's a really great group of folks. It's all voluntary, and I'm grateful to everyone for their hard work. Next slide, please. So there is an online spot for everything we're going to talk to you about today. It's also, Willianne has just put it in the chat. It's eactproject.org. This is what you'll see when you land on it. It's a pretty rudimentary site, but all the resources are there, and everything we do is public. So you can find us there. If I could have the next slide, please. So before I just go into one of the key areas of focus, which was providing best practice considerations and recommendations for sponsors, I just want to say that we have a strategic goal in EACT of making sure that financial neutrality, or as Barbara said, no one should be worse off financially because they were in a trial, and making sure that financial considerations are minimized or eliminated when a patient is discussing a trial with his or her doctor. So our goal is really to advance ways through partnership and collaboration to try to make that concept the norm, and that financial support for patients is the norm in all oncology clinical trials. So if I could have the next slide, please. So one of the things you can find on the website, the EACT website, is this document, Best Practice Recommendations for Sponsors. You can download the report. What you're seeing here is where to find it, the cover, and the table of contents. The goal of this document was to try to fill a gap and help sponsors really understand who's doing what in the space and what a best practice might look like on various different topics. And I'm just going to quickly run through the topic areas that you can see in this document. If I could have the next slide, please. So one of the things that I just want to call out here, Barbara mentioned sort of the overall picture for someone with cancer, and medical costs is obviously an incredible burden on families. We know that. Generally, when you have cancer, you have a significant burden financially just from the diagnosis and from your medical care, which is offset somewhat in the US depending on what kind of insurance you have, but all patients face copays and out-of-pocket costs for medical. When you're in a clinical trial, some of that is taken care of, but you still have medical costs that may be outside what the trial covers and outside what your insurance covers. Then there's a whole suite of non-medical costs, and I'm really going to focus there. And EACT, for the most part, in our several years of working together, has been focused on these non-medical costs, things that have nothing to do with what kind of insurance you have, what your diagnosis is, or the type of institution you're being treated at, but that have everything to do with how you and your family can um, accommodate being in a clinical trial when it adds to your burden in terms of travel and time away from your normal responsibilities that could have a financial impact. So that's really what we're focused on here. There is plenty of data to show that these costs in particular weigh heavily on the minds of patients and sometimes of their doctors when deciding to enroll in a clinical trial or not. So that's kind of our why and our what. So if I could have the next slide, please. So in the document, you'll also find a summary, why we're doing this, what our approach has been, and the purpose of the document to really help sponsors all go to the same place when they think about how they're going to design their particular compensation programs within a particular trial. On the right-hand side of the screen, I know this is very small type, don't worry about it, but just to let you know that we have included a glossary here because some of these terms are used to mean different things depending who's using them and in what context. So we wanted people to understand what we mean in our materials by these terms. And so in particular for financial neutrality, we mean a state of financial equilibrium in which there is no negative financial impact for a patient when they participate in a trial, so that the decision that they make is really made with their doctor based on what's best for their own medical care and their own personal situation and decision making. Next slide. So there are 6 categories in this document. I'm not going to go through them all here, just to let you know that we tried to help sponsors think in terms of corporate policy, communications with participants, working with IRBs, working with sites, and David's going to talk to you about the corollary to this from the site perspective that we've created, making sure that there is a balance between meeting participant needs and avoiding abuse, and making it as simple and efficient as possible for compensation to be provided. Next slide, please. So there are also a number of components to this non-medical out-of-pocket. So we also tried to provide information about what a sponsor might want to consider when thinking about how to design their program and what a recommended approach would be. Again, I'm not going to go through these, but you can see there's considerations and approaches for travel and for meals. Next slide. For caregiving responsibilities, so recognizing that patients may be taking care of children at the same time as they're dealing with their diagnosis and being in a trial. They also may be taking care of an elderly relative or somebody in their family that needs extra care. And we want to make sure that the caregivers are reimbursed, but also that people are reimbursed for care provided to others in their household or in their life. We also have information here around time and lost wages. So this starts to get much more variable. You see a lot of trials that try to support for meals and travel. When you start to get into time and lost wages, so people may not have paid time off, and it's a big deal for them to have to travel and be away from work for a day or two at a time. Not only them, but their caregiver, if they need a caregiver to travel with them. And that can be a huge financial burden on a family that is living on the edge, paycheck to paycheck. Next slide. So technology, there are more and more trials that are requiring some type of technology, either an e-diary or access to the internet or something like that. Not everybody has this access, especially people that are living on the edge financially already before the diagnosis hits. And then we also included some additional considerations for special populations that you can see listed here. We did address the topic of undocumented, which I know is an issue, especially in certain types of hospitals and settings in certain parts of the country. Very thorny issue as well. And we did call out rural because that adds some additional issues if there's not a clinical trial site nearby and or your technology access is limited. Next slide. So if you're really interested in this from a sponsor perspective, we did create a webinar. It's on our website. It was recorded in March. We had great turnout, and the recording is available for you on the EACT website. Okay, next slide. So just briefly, I want to talk about this tax and legal issues again to point out this is from a U.S. perspective. And I should say, while EACT fully recognizes that these are global issues, and we're so glad that the MRCT has a global focus, and many of the sponsors are global and they have issues with what they do in the US versus what they do elsewhere. Most of EACT's work has been really focused and aimed at US sites. So within the US, if I could have the next slide, there are important tax and legal issues to be aware of when it comes to compensation. There are tax implications for trial participants. As Barbara mentioned, there are also safety net program eligibility implications. These things are both tied to whether and how compensation or reimbursement or stipends are tied to income. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And for sponsors, there are administrative burdens to consider. There are legal issues around anti-kickback and civil monetary penalties that have to be addressed. And so, especially a for-profit company sponsor, compliance becomes very important when they're considering whether and how to set up programs to offset financial impacts of trial participants. Next slide. So to address this, the EACT group has produced what I've called an issue brief, which you see in the download spot on the website here and the cover page here. So we tried to put everything in one place to describe what the issues are and what the potential mitigation opportunities are. This document also includes some US policy recommendations because there are efforts within the US Congress to try to provide some safe harbor for sponsors and also to provide some relief on the tax side. Currently in the US, there are caps, annual caps on the amount that one can receive in the form of reimbursement or a stipend without receipts, above which you have to report as income, and there could then be tax and safety net program implications. So if you're interested in these issues, I recommend you take a look at this document. It's not very long, but it also has some very good information about the current regulatory environment and sort of the perspective on the ethics from an IRB perspective. Next slide, please. Okay, that concludes my comments. If there's time, I'm happy to take questions at the end. And certainly, if you want to be in touch with me after this, I'm happy to talk to you more. And again, thanks to Barbara and the team, and I'm going to turn it to David.
Great, Wendy, thanks for a fantastic overview of those topics. I'm going to focus on the experience of clinical trial sites, their staff, and their patients. At heart, I am a clinician. I'm a medical oncologist, and I've always felt that clinical trials bring with them their own sets of complexities. And one of the things that we have really striven to do within EACT is try to simplify these considerations related to financial support, financial neutrality, and the relevant resources for clinical trial site staff. But I will say sometimes it feels like other trends are working against us. Next slide, please. So this is a study that we did a few years ago, just trying to get a sense of trends in cancer clinical trials. And I recognize that many of you are involved in fields other than cancer, but I think the principles still apply. To start with, when I think about a patient qualifying for or needing a clinical trial, in general, my assumption is that something is wrong medically, right? If it's cancer, either it's a new cancer diagnosis, or maybe it's a prior cancer that has now come back or recurred, or it's a cancer that's been treated and the treatment is no longer working. It's a progressing cancer. So we need to think about the medical issues. We need to think about the emotional issues, the mental issues, the psychological issues, all going on at the time that someone is being considered for a clinical trial. And yet, despite that, and despite decades of calls to simplify clinical trials, what you can see on the left side of this slide and in the middle figure is that the number and categories of eligibility criteria have grown tremendously over the past decades. And the table on the right of the slide shows that the number of tests that need to be done before someone even starts trial treatment is increasing over time, while at the same time, the amount of time allowed for the patient to complete all of those required tests is shrinking. Next slide. So it's not surprising that when you think about the interactions that are required to get a patient on a clinical trial and treat them on a clinical trial, it's tremendously complex. And as someone who lives in Dallas, to me, this looks like an American Airlines flight map when there are tornadoes in Missouri and Oklahoma. All of these interactions are required not only before patients go on trials, but throughout their care. And in the middle of this figure, which we created by interviewing individual clinical trial site staff, you see the research nurse, the clinic nurse, and the physician or the investigator. And they form what I consider the Bermuda Triangle, surrounding the patient, trying to provide the best care we possibly can, and trying to the extent we can to protect that person from all of these behind the scenes complexities. Next slide. Despite that, I do think that patients are aware of how complex this is because clinical trials can add extra requirements for both staff and patients beyond routine clinical standard care. Clinical trials often have strict timelines that require clinic staff to make last-minute appointments. And if it's a busy center, that's hard to work around. So how can we ask sites to fit considerations of financial support on top of all of these things that are already being added to the care of a patient who might be sick and might be anxious and worried? Next slide. So we weren't surprised to see that awareness, understanding, and the potential impact of financial support may remain limited among sites. Now, again, this EACT project here is focused on oncology. So this is a survey of about 60 cancer centers that was conducted a little over a year ago, November 2024. And on the left, you'll see that fewer than 10% of sites rated their level of awareness of financial support programs for clinical trial participants as high. The majority of sites rated their awareness as medium or moderate. In the middle, 70% of sites do not collect data on how often trial participants might seek financial assistance for trial-related expenses, and 75% of sites don't collect data on how often potential trial candidates choose not to participate in trials due to the financial burden. On the right, you can see that in that red bar, over 40% of sites reported that their institutions have restrictions on the use of industry-sponsored financial support programs for trial participants. Next slide. How such support is best provided is still a little bit unclear. So as part of this survey, we asked responding sites, what type of financial support is most preferred by site staff? And it seemed like stipends or compensation for expenses that had already been incurred for travel and meals was the leading preference, with prepayment option uh, or stipends for time and effort, like visit completions and e-diary completions, the second most preferred. Prepayment for expenses was less preferred among site staff, but among trial participants, prepayment for expenses was a preferred method along with stipends. Next slide. So what is our call to action? And here I want to focus on the sites. Ideally, we'd like to create a situation where site staff are educated and aware of the impact of out-of-pocket costs on trial participants and the availability and the rules for accessing support programs. But remember, we're already adding this expectation on top of very, very extensive, complex requirements of their daily job. Depending on the staff role, these individuals should become familiar with institutional policies, regulatory and legal requirements, and available resources. And for certain trial site staff, they really need to be engaging with and pressing trial sponsors up front during budget negotiations to ensure that adequate funding is provided and the processes are streamlined to minimize the administrative burden on staff and trial participants. Appropriate trial site staff should be able to assess patients' individual circumstances and needs in managing these out-of-pocket financial impact of trial participation up front. And we know that's a difficult thing to talk to people about, and again, at various points throughout the trial. And there should be clear processes in place to support participants in accessing available financial support throughout the trial. Next slide. So there are multiple opportunities to address financial support. Early on, when a site is planning with budget negotiations and grant preparation, and I will tell you that oftentimes when grants are reviewed, when these considerations are included, that is considered highly favorable. Trial review, at IRB discussion, and when the institution is negotiating with the trial sponsor regarding the budget. At activation and enrollment, when you're recruiting participants and you're consenting them, and throughout the conduct to monitor enrolled patients for any financial toxicity that they're experiencing, which may allow them to complete the trial in a better fashion and help with retention of participants on trials. Next slide. So EACT has resources that are really designed to help sites assess these needs and resources. One is the Participant Needs Assessment and Discussion Guide. And on the right, you'll see engaging with sponsors about financial support programs for participants. Because in a way, the sites are really sitting in the middle, right? That's that sandwich with on the one side, you've got the trial participant, that patient, their family, their caregivers and loved ones. And on the other side, you've got the sponsor. And we as sites, we're sitting in between, and we need to juggle interests and aspects from both sides. Next slide. So in the best practices guide for sites, we talk about the approach. And we home in on 3 problem areas to address through our working groups. And you could see that in the middle box in the middle column, right? Inconsistent implementation of support programs among sponsors. Think about that, right? Already, trial site staff, trial clinical research staff need to keep in mind the different eligibility criteria and the different treatment schedules across trials. Now they're needing to keep in mind the different types and modalities of financial support programs. There's lack of communication between trial sponsors and trial site staff, and between the site staff and protective participants around the existence and scope of these programs. And as Wendy touched on, there are legal and tax implications. So what's the purpose of this guide, right? It's to help sites understand the sources of out-of-pocket costs for trial participants, to define financial neutrality and the types of compensation available for non-medical costs during trial participation, to outline key roles and responsibilities across site personnel, to address tax and legal issues, and to provide examples of various approaches among cancer clinical trial sites. Next slide. So this shows you a form or an approach that could be used when site personnel are engaging with sponsors about financial support for participants. So this is at the level of each trial, right? So during budget negotiations, staff can ask trial sponsors these questions regarding support for non-medical out-of-pocket participant costs. The first question, number 1 on the left, does the sponsor offer financial support for trial participants' non-medical out-of-pocket costs? Now, sites use all kinds of criteria to decide whether or not to activate a particular trial, and maybe this factor might get included in the future. And if the answer is yes, then you'll see the downstream questions. Number 2, are there eligibility requirements? And if so, what are they? What type of support is offered? Prepayments or reimbursement? And how is that support provided in terms of how frequent, what's the interval, and how are they dispensed? If it's reimbursement, what's the procedure for submitting and approving the reimbursements? What are the participants' responsibilities? What are the site's responsibilities? And now at the bottom of the middle column, what expenses are considered reimbursable? Personal auto travel, tolls, mileage, taxi, rideshare, public transportation. On the top right, airfare, train, parking, lodging, meals, childcare, elder care, pet care. These participants on clinical trials have a lot of responsibilities, lost wages, and equipment. For example, IT needs, if someone needs broadband internet access for virtual visits on a trial. Next slide. Our negotiating with sponsors checklist is available at this website and through this QR code. And again, you'll be given these slides. Next slide. Now we're talking about the interaction of our trial staff at sites and the participants or potential participants on trials. So at the top left, you'll see that it just breaks down the trial requirements in terms of logistics. How often are the visits? Will another adult need to accompany that person while they're going on the trial? What are the needs assessments for the patient? Bottom left column. Responsibilities, daycare, elder care, pet care, child pickup. If financial assistance were available, would it help? Next slide. Would financial assistance with, prior slide. Next column, middle column, top. Would financial assistance with costs related to travel help you adhere to your appointment schedule? Next question, will you need overnight lodging? Number 4, do you know whether your insurance has coverage? Would you like to meet with a financial counselor for help in reviewing your coverage? And will you or a caregiver need to miss work? Just a way up front to consistently and systematically evaluate these considerations that otherwise probably aren't going to rise to the top of discussions because there's so much else happening at this time. And then the far right column is something that site personnel can help fill out for patients to remind them of available resources. The top of that column shows which categories the trial provides assistance with. The next section shows resources that might be provided by a healthcare institution, because there are institutions that may have other sources of financial support, whether through the American Cancer Society, other regional philanthropic sources, or the institution itself. Local resources and national resources. Next slide. As with the other checklist, this participant needs assessment checklist is available through the EACT website, through this QR code, and through the participant needs assessment and discussion guide. Next slide. As with the sponsor content, we did present the site-related content in a webinar that was recorded a little over a year ago in December 2024. It was a 90-minute session with nursing credit provided by the Oncology Nursing Society. We had over 300 registrants, 200 live participants. This is where you can find the content. And our next webinar, Sites 201, is currently planned for February 2026. Next slide. That brings us to the end of this section. And Barbara, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your incredible presentation and description. And again, all these slides will be available, and the links that you didn't capture in the chat are there. We have a number of questions that I'll begin with, but I do want to say, it shouldn't be lost on us that solving for financial toxicity also improves retention in the clinical trial. People drop out because they can't afford what we're asking them to do, not because they want to drop out, but because they can't afford it. So I think that's really incredibly important. And similarly, the idea of having a prepaid CLIN card or some other method to sort of charge those expenses saves the participant from having to be out of pocket waiting for the reimbursement, saving those receipts. And I think that we should be sensitive to that as well, because it is burdensome. One of the questions is, how do we think about missed work or lost wages? I wonder if either of you want to speak to that.
Sure, I can start. And I also want to thank David, not only for everything he does here, but he takes care of a lot of patients and, kind of lives this every day. So super grateful for him in the oncology space and his leadership. And one other thing I'll just say about the participant needs assessment tool, Barbara, to the point you just made, which is that we specifically through EACT recommend that tool not just be used upfront for enrollment, but be used periodically throughout the trial, because we have heard that patients say, oh, I can manage, it's fine. And then they get into it and they realize, I can't really manage this. I need help. And so a periodic check-in is important for retention, to your point. Oh my God, I just forgot the question you asked.
Missed work and lost wages.
Oh, yes. So we talk about that. It's in our documents. It is a real thing. And we do encourage sponsors to provide compensation for time away. I mentioned when I spoke about, people needing to take paid time off if they have it, or if they're hourly and they don't. That's a very real impact, especially if they have to travel, especially if it's frequent. And even there was a question about decentralized trials. And there is still time away from work or childcare needed if you have to do a virtual visit. So an Apple Watch is nice, but that's not going to help you pay your nanny or your, somebody taking time off work to watch your kids, or, whatever, to help you do that, or if you need to miss a day of work because you need to stay home to do these visits or whatever. So I think it's important to be equitable across the different types of trials. And I do think that people should, again, our goal is that there should be no negative financial impact in any way to a person from deciding to be in a clinical trial. And so if that means that they have lost wages, that's something they need to be compensated for.
So if I can, the only thing that I would say is that I think, we have to be reasonable about the expectation of lost wages. I mean, if somebody is making a huge amount of money, that doesn't count in the same way as somebody who's living at the margin. And what we've recommended is to establish what seems like a reasonable response, 2 times minimum wage, 4 times minimum wage, something that is reasonable, but not based on what a reported salary would be, because that, I think that is an expectation that goes beyond what people can do reasonably.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that the whole point of this is that we should be helping people on the margins who otherwise couldn't participate. Certainly that's the focus here.
Yeah. David, did you
Yeah,
want to?
sure. Barbara, it's quite rare that I see a sponsor use terminology like lost wages. But I do see, for example, per visit compensation. What's interesting is that my sense so far, and I don't know all fields, but I happen to know 2 fields of clinical research very well. One is cancer clinical trials, because that's what I do, and the other is mental health clinical research, which is what my wife does. And it seems like mental health clinical trials almost always offer compensation per visit. So if someone goes for a visit and they're supposed to get 5 vials of blood drawn and 4 are drawn and another needs to be drawn the next day, they get compensated for that extra unplanned visit. In oncology clinical trials, I almost never see compensation per visit.
Well, part of this, just to say, is that there used to be this idea that if you compensate per visit for somebody that needs to be seen anyway as an oncology patient, you're unduly influencing their participation in a trial in order to be paid, as if somebody's going to decide to do this because they get their parking reimbursed or, $50 a visit. But that's the theory behind being, oncology being different, in quotes, which I think all of us would, I hope, reject as if it's an ethical trial based on an IRB review without consideration of reimbursement, you cannot be unduly influencing somebody because they're reimbursed at that point.
Or at
So
least acknowledge that participating in a clinical trial 90% of the time involves more visits than if one weren't on a trial in oncology.
So one of the things that came up a few times in the chat is the expectation that study staff personnel will understand and be, enough about tax liabilities and benefit eligibility and all of the other issues. And that seems to be beyond what they're trained to do. Or so how do you think about that in terms of who's giving that information and how are they supposed to, um, uh, get up to speed on these complexities?
Well, I could start. Certainly that's a challenge. We know, and especially recently, after COVID and everything else, the people who work on trials and just generally healthcare professionals in sites have a lot to do, and there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress. And I don't think that's what we're trying to do here. In fact, by creating some of these resources, we were hoping to make it easier. But There are navigation teams at, especially at the main oncology clinical trial site, NCI designated cancer sites and so forth, and some of the surrounding facilities that are connected. So there are patient navigators, there are financial navigators, there are clinical trial operations team. So there's usually a team of people, and so trying to provide resources to make this more seamless. We're also aware that, when a sponsor brings a trial to a site and, they're presenting the whole trial, and David, you can certainly talk about this, there's a lot that they're discussing. The trial itself, how it works, inclusion criteria, all the important aspects. And, this little piece might get short shrift, which is part of why we created that tool, that checklist to talk to sponsors, because we know that, that might get buried in the very important discussion about what's the drug being tested, what are the side effects, what's the visit schedule, all that stuff, which is so important. So we wanted to kind of give a little boost there. And then likewise, I just want to say, the participant needs assessment tool, one of the things we know is that the informed consent document might include, on page 64, a small paragraph that says, and, there's compensation provided. Again, there's a lot to talk about with the patient in the informed consent process. And we've kind of recommended that those conversations happen, before you get to the official informed consenting process, to really understand the participant's needs, so that you can get to that. So anyway, David, did you want to respond?
Yeah, Barbara, you raise a great point. And there's no doubt that at any major medical center, academic or otherwise, clinical trials are an incredibly complex operation, right? At our center, just in oncology, we have over 100 FTE, right, in the clinical trials office. And at any given time, I don't know, we probably have close to 300 active protocols. And I don't think it makes sense for every person in the clinical trials office or all clinicians to necessarily feel like they need to have expertise in the tax and legal considerations or have participated in the discussion with the sponsor. But I do think the activation of clinical trials always goes through a funnel of some sort, right? Is that scientific review? Is that budget review? Is that the ethical or IRB review? I think that's the point at which those questions might be looked at by a relatively small group of individuals within an institution, and then that information shared with those downstream who'll be using it.
And I do want to emphasize that at least recently, when we've put in to the sponsor budgets an expectation for reimbursement or prepayment, whatever, we have not gotten pushback, which is really, really thrilling that there has been this sea change. And thank you, Wendy, for leading at least a significant part of that, and David for advocating. And I do think that it's something that you said, Wendy, that we should be doing this periodically during the clinical trial experience, because people's situations do change. One person pointed out that you can lose insurance, medical insurance, and that changes the situation. You can, another person may need support in the family, which then changes your experience. And if we don't ask, people are not always going to offer it. So I really do think that this is something we need to, as a community, take responsibility for, at least being proactive about how we think about supporting our participants in clinical trials and doing everything we can. And you've done such a great job of, promoting best practices, making everything available. David, for your advocacy, Wendy, for your incredible sort of spirit, energy, and organization. It's been a pleasure to work together, and I look forward to continuing to do so. And with that, let me really thank all the participants as well. here today, your wonderful questions, those that we didn't get time to answer. We're going to try to sort of capture and put them together for everybody to see. So thank you so much. And again, thank you to my colleagues, David and Wendy.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays. You will get a survey as you sign off. Please do spend 2 minutes finishing that.